SRI launched one of the world's first AI labs nearly 60 years ago, and we've made groundbreaking advances in the field ever since. Shaky, the first mobile robot with the ability to perceive its surroundings, reason, and act in response to humans. The technology that led to Siri. Innovations in computer vision that helped enable autonomous driving. Augmented reality trainings. AI that improves healthcare, that addresses critical issues in energy and sustainability, that improves design and manufacturing, and that protects against evolving threats to our national and personal security. And by embedding AI within learning environments, SRI is helping define the very future of education and work. Today, our work in AI spans multiple labs and locations, but our human-centered approach remains the same as ever. Working across disciplines and in close collaboration with our government and commercial customers to create new technologies while strengthening the guardrails so we can all truly benefit from AI's extraordinary promise.
Greetings and welcome to SRI's PARC Forum. I'm Christiana McFarland, Director of SRI Center for Innovation, Strategy, and Policy, or CISP. In CISP, we partner with public and private organizations to create lasting economic and social impact through investments in science and technology, including AI. Today, I have the distinct honor of welcoming to the forum Karen Hao, a journalist and author, who will discuss her new book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI, and explore transparency, accountability, and power dynamics of AI. Karen's work has been published in The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and the MIT Technology Review. She leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series. Before my discussion with Karen, we'll hear from Dr. Karen Myers, Director of SRI's Artificial Intelligence Center, about the center's mission-driven AI research. Dr. Myers specializes in intelligent systems for human-machine collaboration and is a fellow at the Association for the Advancement of AI. She holds a PhD from Stanford and received the 2023 VentureBeat Women in AI Award. Welcome to our virtual stage, Dr. Myers.
Thanks, Christy. I'd like to start out by congratulating Karen Hao on her book. It's a real tour de force and makes a very valuable contribution by shining light on some important questions related to AI, specifically around why and how the technology is being developed. And then also, the potential societal disruptions that AI might cause and what that impact will be on different kinds of communities. In reading through the book, there were a few themes that resonated with me, and I thought I would just briefly highlight some of those before we turn things back to Christy and Karen for a discussion between the two of them. One is the need to reduce the resource intensiveness of modern AI systems. A lot of people are probably aware that AI systems use a lot of energy for training and also these days as well for usage, now that we've moved from sort of getting simple answers back from systems like ChatGPT to having them do query time reasoning to come up with better answers. But another big problem is the amount of water that's necessary to cool data centers. And there have been some nice articles in the media recently talking about some specific examples of that and the impact that's having on local communities. This is certainly a big concern. I think one thing that I have to say about this, though, is that it's still very early days in the field, right? We're still at this stage where people are inventing these great new algorithms, these new ideas, new training approaches. And we haven't really gotten to the point yet where people are looking at how to optimize these so that they can perform better using fewer resources and much more efficiently. So we're starting to see a lot more research in that space of trying to reduce the resource footprint of these different technologies. And I think we'll see a lot more advances over the next few years. One example of this kind of thing is shifting to smaller language models. So being able to distill from a large model like a ChatGPT to create a much smaller model that can run with a smaller footprint and use many fewer resources. We're involved with some of that work here at SRI. Also looking at some related work, developing new kinds of machine learning algorithms that can run on edge devices. So run on your phone, for example. So using very low levels of power and memory, and still be able to learn pretty good models from the data that's available. Another type of approach in this area that could reduce the resource intensiveness of building AI systems is exploring what we at SRI are calling neurosymbolic methods. The idea here is that you don't have to necessarily just rely on data-driven techniques where you need lots of data, big models, and lots of training resources in order to get them to work well. But in lots of areas, you already have a lot of compiled human expertise, and it makes a lot more sense to take advantage of that. So building hybrid systems where you're doing the neural part, the learning from the data, and combining it with the symbolic part where you've got some kind of symbolic representation of the knowledge or expertise that you have. So for me, just a very simple but very compelling example of this is something like arithmetic. When the early large language models came out, they were terrible at arithmetic. The companies building these models have spent a lot of time improving that performance. But at some level, why would you do that other to show that you can learn from data to learn the ability to do arithmetic? We already have the knowledge of how to build systems that do arithmetic perfectly well. It doesn't make sense to try to learn that kind of thing from scratch. The second theme that resonated with me is the over-focus on AGI right now at a lot of the big AI companies. First of all, there's a question of what does AGI even mean? There's no real agreement on that term. In the early days of the field of AI, people talked about the Turing test, which really meant that a human interacting with an unknown party wouldn't be able to distinguish whether or not they were talking to a computer or to a human. I think most people would agree that we now have systems that pass the Turing test, but I think as well, we're still a long ways from anything that might be construed as AGI. The current models that we have are really impressive, but they also just fall short in some very, very basic ways. Lots of ways having to do with common sense reasoning. And I think that's a big issue in terms of ever getting to something that somebody might consider to be AGI. So the over-focus on AGI also, I think, means that people have forgotten about the tremendous value that more narrow AI systems have provided. So think about AlphaFold, which won the Nobel Prize last year for the amazing work on doing computational protein structure prediction. And that's really revolutionized the whole field of structural biology and is having significant impact on drug discovery and disease understanding. Another interesting example of narrow AI is something like reading mammograms, where AI systems now do better than trained doctors in terms of being able to interpret the images and identify cancer, especially very early stages of it. At SRI, an example of something that we're doing there right now is, so we've got a group that just came up with some really cool technology for doing discovery of critical minerals. So identifying from geological information places where it's highly likely that some of those critical minerals can be found. The third topic that I'll mention briefly before turning things over to Christy and Karen is the importance of designing AI systems that work in collaboration with humans. I think that's also another negative consequence of the focus on AGI is that, for me, the reality is going to be that the AI is going to be a tool that humans are going to use to make themselves more effective and really elevate their performance. And we really should be thinking right now about how we build those systems so that they're designed to work effectively with humans. One example of this, I mentioned reading mammograms, and AI does better than trained radiologists. But in fact, what they found is that the radiologists working with the AI tools do even better than the AI system working on its own. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years. At SRI, we have been focused for many decades on this critical question of how you build AI systems so that they really complement human problem-solving skills. We're looking specifically in a couple of areas that I'll just briefly mention. One is the idea of making the tools really collaborative, right? So when you interact with ChatGPT, it's not a collaborative system. You can ask it questions and it gives you the answers. But if we're really going to have AIs working beside us when we do our day-to-day jobs, we really want something where they're more like a partner. They understand what our goals are. They understand what we're trying to do. They can take actions to really complement what we're doing, maybe doing things ahead of us because they can anticipate the needs that we're going to have. So with that, maybe I will wrap up and just say that, I do think Karen has identified some really important issues and concerns around the field, and I'm looking forward to hearing her talk about those more in our session today. But of course, as an AI researcher, I'm very excited about the field, and although she does raise a lot of really important concerns, I'm also very confident that we as a community will be able to come up with ways to address some of those. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christy and Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. Before I let you go, I know some on the line today are going to be more of a lay audience. Can you just briefly describe AGI before we get too much further into the conversation with Karen Hao?
Sure. AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. And it's, again, it's not a well-defined term, but generally means that we can get AI systems that perform beyond human levels in terms of their capability and sort of across a range of different fields.
Great. Thank you. We look forward to coming back with you towards the end of our discussion today. Now I'd like to welcome Karen Hao to PARC Forum. Karen, you have spent years tracking how AI is reshaping industries and society, and recently published your book, Empire of AI. Congratulations. We'll spend our time today talking about the book, digging into some of the themes introduced by Dr. Myers, and focusing on the impacts of AI on economies, communities, and workers. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So just to get started, interesting title of your book. Maybe just start with, why do you compare AI to an empire?
The phrase empire of AI is specifically referring to OpenAI and companies like OpenAI, which I talk about as empires. And I really loved Dr. Myers' remarks to frame this conversation, because I absolutely am a big believer in certain types of AI technologies being very transformative. And I love the positive note of believing that the fields can really get to a place like that. But my book focuses on specifically critiquing the paradigm of AI development that has really come to dominate, that has emerged from Silicon Valley, and is most simply summarized as growth at all costs, scale at all costs. And I call these companies empires because if you look at empires of old and the features and characteristics they had, they would lay claim to resources that were not their own. They exploited a lot of labor, as in they didn't pay that labor, or they paid very little labor. And they created this sense that there was a aggressive race for humanity, where there were evil empires that could bring humanity to doom, and there were good empires that could bring humanity to utopia. And so, like, the British Empire would portray themselves as more morally superior than the Dutch Empire. The French Empire would portray itself as better than the British Empire. And ultimately, all of the resource extraction, labor exploitation that was happening around the world was meant to help the good empire be able to perform its civilizing mission, which was to bring the rest of the world into modernity, and give them progress. And this is exactly what we're seeing with empires of AI today. They also lay claim to resources that are not their own, like the data of users that have posted things online that without any informed consent of realizing that that could be used to train AI models, the work of writers and creators who are now suing these companies because they are losing economic opportunity at the behest of these models that have become substitutes for their work. And they exploit a lot of labor, both the labor of workers who are contracted by these companies to do data annotation and content moderation, but also in the sense that these general AI systems, or AGI adjacent systems, are explicitly defined to be labor automating machines. OpenAI defines AGI as highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. And finally, they of course do this in a hyper-competitive race where they say that the stakes are incredibly high and that they're doing it all for the benefit of humanity. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we're not really talking about multinational corporations anymore, just operating in a business space, trying to gain a monopoly in business. we are talking about companies that have enormous economic leverage and political leverage. And they are really starting to terraform our Earth, remake our economy, and remake our politics and geopolitics in ways that are very self-serving of them, and leaving the rest or the majority of the world kind of grappling with a loss of agency, a loss of economic opportunity, and other kinds of dispossession.
Yeah, thank you for that background. I think it's really helpful, and you touched on a lot of the key themes that I think we can dig into a little bit more right now, particularly when you talk about exploitation and extraction. I want to touch on that a little bit. Accountability, I think, is sort of a huge issue that, as we think about AI and the developments in AI and our ability to keep up with it and form some governance around AI, I'd love to touch on that as well. So let's just start with, in your book, you do dive into some powerful stories about data annotators in Venezuela, for example, or some of the tough choices that communities in places like Arizona are facing when it comes to hosting data centers. And I think that these stories do a really nice job of illustrating what we mean by the global AI supply chain, right? It's that sort of a big amorphous concept, but I think you really bring it home when you talk about the real life impacts of what this looks like. Can you tell us a little bit more from your perspective, sort of why you introduce these stories and what they reveal about the global AI supply chain?
One of the promises that I made to myself when I started this book was I really couldn't tell the story of Silicon Valley's manifestation of AI by staying in Silicon Valley, because if you only tell the story from the center of power, you can't really illustrate the full extent of how outside at the edges of the power, this global system of power, that things can really fall apart and really harm individuals and communities. And so I ended up going to Kenya, to Colombia, to Chile, to Uruguay, and to places like rural Arizona to just show how when this particular vision of AI interfaces with the real world, it really does not actually allow for certain groups of people to have a future where they also get to benefit from this technology. So one of the stories that I highlight in the book is this group of Kenyan workers who were contracted by OpenAI because at that point in time, OpenAI was just beginning to move from research to commercialization. And they realized that if they put GPT models in the hands of users that could say anything, that it wouldn't exactly be a big consumer success for those models to suddenly start spewing hate speech, racist, sexist language, other types of abuse. And so they went to Kenya, which over the last decade has really become a backstop for a lot of global north internet companies in doing some of the cleanup work of the internet, and hire these workers to create a content moderation filter where they were given reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI generated text where OpenAI had prompted models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And then these workers had to very carefully annotate this data in a taxonomy that OpenAI gave them to categorize, is this violent content? Is this sexual content? Is this extremely graphic violent content? Is this sexual abuse content that involves children? Um, and ultimately, we've heard this story before with social media. Content moderators for Facebook, for example, have had PTSD for years after doing the work. And what I found was these Kenyan workers, it was exactly the same thing. And I highlight this one man story, Mofat Okinye, who not only was he affected, he was on the sexual content team, but his family was affected. He changed so much as a person and was unable to really articulate to his wife what his job was because he was so ashamed to say that he was reading sex content all day that she ultimately left him and took her daughter from a previous relationship who he really loved and called his baby girl with her. And that is ultimately, I think, kind of illustrates to you the logic of empire, where there are people who work within these companies that are paid $1 million compensation packages and are ordained to be the real ones bringing value to these companies. And then the actual workforce that OpenAI could not have actually built their huge consumer success without our paid $2 an hour and have these really devastating consequences.
Yeah, there's clearly a human cost to all of this, as well as another element that you get into, and Dr. Myers referenced it as well in terms of resource intensity, right? Whether that's water or energy. So many of the challenges associated with AI, in addition, obviously, to the human cost, are driven by resource intensity. From your perspective, are there opportunities for AI systems that are more sustainable and less extractive? And, what would that look like?
Absolutely. I mean, based on what Dr. Myers was saying, like this quest for AGI has made everyone forget about predictive narrow AI systems, but there is so much evidence to show that predictive narrow AI systems are actually the workhorses that can allow us to not just be more efficient themselves, but actually improve global sustainability. So there's this amazing nonprofit called Climate Change AI that has done the work of cataloging all different types of AI technologies that they think can really help tackle high leverage problems when it comes to actually fighting the climate crisis. So one example they have is weather prediction. That is a narrow AI system that has nothing to do with AGI, so-called general systems. They also talk about integrating renewable energy into the grid, because in order to do that more effectively and increase the amount of share of renewables on the grid, we have to be able to better predict when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, and need to better optimize how to distribute that energy to energy users, to still have a resilient grid at the end of the day. And so I think that is what I dream of for how we can actually use AI in beneficial ways, and also use AI that doesn't have these harmful supply chains attached to them.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because, we typically think of AI as sort of one thing, and unless you get down to sort of the nuance of it and really understand really the problems that need to be solved, there are multiple avenues to doing that.
Yeah.
And being able to focus more on narrow AI and think about the resource footprint associated with that versus AGI, I think is a compelling case. I want to move into accountability. I know obviously that's a critical theme of your book. In your view, what does real accountability in AI look like? Obviously, there are these atrocious human costs. There's the sort of water consumption, other energy issues with land. What does real accountability look like, especially for those people and places that don't have much power in the current system?
What was really amazing when I was reporting on these vulnerable communities is you would think that they are, at the bottom of the global power hierarchy. They definitely don't have any voice, and yet they were the ones who understood the most how to create a voice. It is remarkable that there were Kenyan workers who, after suffering this horrific exploitation, caught the attention of international media and actually got their story to the front page of the Wall Street Journal. That's what I ended up writing the story for. And that they then caught the attention. They have now gotten visits from U.S. congressional members. They have gotten calls from international human labor rights organizations. And in Chile, I met activists who had been fighting tooth and nail to resist data centers from taking their fresh water resources during severe historic droughts within the country. And they have also been able to escalate. Their fight basically went from escalating to it was a Google data center. So it first escalated to Google Chile. They kept fighting. It escalated to Google Mountain View. They kept fighting, and it escalated once again to the international media, and drawing all this attention to the fact that there were no guardrails around how the data center would operate. There were no guarantees on how much resource use this data center would use, and whether or not it would even give any kind of economic benefit back to the community that was hosting it. And so I think real accountability really looks like that: broad coalition building, collective action, where people actually assert what they want for their future. And they participate in the AI development process at all of the different, what I call sites of democratic contestation, like all of the different ingredients that actually go into developing AI models and all of the places where AI models are deployed. Those are places where people who are impacted should voice their concerns, have a say, and force these companies to the table, force their governments to the table too, and be able to better represent their views in ultimately what the governments do, or what the companies do.
You know, I think there's raising awareness obviously is a critical first step, and they've been successful. I think two questions I have from that. One, have you seen instances where that has transitioned to changes in what actually is happening? And secondly, I want to pull the thread a little bit more on democratic AI. And how that looks at different stages in terms of sort of tangible examples of what that possibly could be. So first, you know, have we seen any of those transitions where raising that awareness has led to true adaptation within the system?
One of the things that, for a few years ago, I think people didn't even realize that there were people that got contracted to feed AI systems, and do data annotation work. And since then, as awareness has raised, there are more and more firms that are starting to try and figure out, can I be a more ethical data annotator? There's also industry coalitions that are coming together to try and figure out, like, can we raise the floor on the conditions that we provide? There are also, like U.S. congressional members, when they went to visit the workers, the workers told me that the question the congressional members asked was, what can we do in the U.S. to support your cause from a legislative perspective? And so there are changes that are starting to happen. Of course, it takes time. And in Chile, what was interesting was the activists did actually get a seat at the table with the Chilean government after escalating their cause. And so the Chilean government created a new community listening forum. When they created their national data center plan, they brought in those activists and all of these other community residents, when initially the government wasn't going to do that at all. And now every draft of the plan actually passes through this forum where they get feedback directly from the people who are literally having the data center next to their homes. And so there are changes, but of course, like, these are still at the moment one-off examples. There hasn't been, of course, a change in the global trajectory of the dominant AI development paradigm and this quest for AGI, but they show a case study for what many other groups could do and replicate and create enough of that pressure that it can actually shift the trajectory.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's an excellent example, as well as when you talk about sort of democratic AI and being
Yeah.
able to really have a seat at the table, right? Which
Exactly.
which clearly is critical. I just want to remind the audience to please drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. All right, Karen, moving on. So I want to talk a little bit, shifting gears just a little bit, talking about AI industry application and regional development. As AI drives innovation across sectors like life sciences, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, what does this mean for regional development? Are new innovation hubs, for example, starting to emerge, or are we really just seeing sort of the same old places that have been successful in terms of technology, reaping most of the benefits?
I think at the moment we are seeing Silicon Valley reap most of the benefits. But what is amazing is that there are more and more communities, more and more cities, regions, countries that are realizing that they do not want to be left behind this time and just have AI development be an export to their community with a particular worldview that Silicon Valley puts into these technologies. And so we are seeing, one of the groups that I ended up interviewing when I was in Chile was their National AI Research Center of Excellence, where they are actually trying to create their own, what is the Chilean vision of AI. There's also, of course, the deep learning Indaba community in the African continent, where they also ask similar questions about how do we reimagine what AI can be so it's by Africans for Africans. And a lot of the work that they do, for example, is actually on narrow AI applications related to agriculture, to support the production of food, and other types of challenges that the African continent might face that is just not relevant to this conception of AGI. So we are seeing that popping up, but it is these places do also struggle to get enough investment because there are so many people in the public or among policymakers that do kind of get swept up in the AGI narrative, as Dr. Myers alluded to, where they think, wait a minute, should we also be building a large language model, or should we just be partnering with OpenAI? OpenAI just rolled out OpenAI for countries, where it's really trying to perpetuate this narrative of, no, you don't invest locally, just use our technologies and we'll help you. But there is certainly more and more appetite, I think, in a lot of regions in the world, and also in the US, in a lot of cities that aren't typically seen as technology leaders. There's a lot more appetite to be involved.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, particularly in some of the work that we've done in the Center for Innovation Strategy and Policy and working with communities, one is that, AI is sort of a critical element or ingredient for for innovation in some of the industries that they're trying to accelerate, right? So,
Yeah.
Or just overall supporting AI development and innovation within their states or their regions. I think, the difference is when you're dealing with states and regions like that is, there are real people, there are real interactions. You have constituents who are going to be voicing concerns. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of experimentation at the state and regional level to create policies, right? Or to create those guardrails so that there can be innovation and acceleration within AI in a helpful way. But there's going to be constant pushback to help create guardrails that are useful for the community. So hopefully we can learn from some of that as well.
Exactly.
Moving to human machine collaboration, right? So as AI becomes more embedded in industry, and again, we're seeing AI be that vertical across different industries that often is helping to accelerate some of those innovations that wouldn't be possible previously. But there's a growing tension, obviously, between fears of automation, right, particularly in the manufacturing setting, and hopes for new jobs and human AI collaboration. Dr. Myers obviously spoke about this a bit. How should we think about AI's impact on the workforce, both the risks and the opportunities that it presents?
I think right now, with this quest for AGI, framing AI as an everything machine, there's potentially going to be massive impacts on the workforce, because we are already seeing, even when the technology is not mature enough, executives moving to lay off workers and try and install AI systems instead. There was recently an example of a company that did that and then walked it back. They laid off a bunch of workers, and then they said, oops, we realized we need to rehire you. But obviously it can be really devastating, the number of layoffs that are now happening and the number of industries that can be impacted, because executives sort of get caught up in the hype of believing that these AI systems can replace workers. But I think a second part of your question is sort of also, what could we do differently? And I really love the study that Dr. Myers brought up, which is one that I always cite too, of the radiologists who, when they are assisted by AI, actually outperform AI or the radiologists alone. And that, to me, is the model that we really should use to imagine what kinds of AI systems we want to move towards, because there's certainly many ways that AI could be more assistive and augment the capabilities of humans rather than trying to take away the things that humans are already good at. Why don't we, instead of trying to recreate humans, why don't we just try and plug in the weaknesses of what humans don't do, but computers are good at, and leave the humaning to the humans?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's helpful that we're starting to see effective models of that. And I think at the end, Dr. Myers, we'll come back to you. I want to sort of tease this one out a little bit more in terms of maybe some of those core principles around designing AI to support and not replace human workers. So we'll come back to that. All right, Karen Hao. So thinking about the future of AI, if you were to imagine a more inclusive AI-enabled economy 10 years from now, what values or priorities would be at its foundation? So understanding that AI is probably not going away,
Yeah.
but we want it to be supportive of human activity and aligned with our values. So what do you see as the core values and priorities to be at the foundation today as we move forward into the future?
I guess that the question is really ultimately like, what kind of values do we want to underpin society in the future? Because that is ultimately then what values we want to put into our technologies. And to me, sustainability and equitability, like a sustainable and equitable future, are the most important values, in that we want everyone to have equal access to opportunity for a dignified life, where they can have great access to education, great access to healthcare, great access to economic opportunity, and be able to do fulfilling work. And so if we can hold that goal front and center, then an AI-enabled economy that would be what I want to move towards is just lots and lots of smaller task-specific AI models that are integrated into all of these different ecosystems, that are developed with a lot of community participation, that are bespoke to different types of groups based on their needs, that all helps ultimately facilitate those most important goals. So I think we've sort of gotten to a point where it sometimes feels like people are now in service of technology with this AGI rhetoric. And what I really hope is that we move back to a
With the
place where
narrative.
technology is
Yeah.
actually in service of people.
And, just on that point, as a journalist, how do you see your role in doing that?
Continuing to raise awareness about how these technologies are built, and explaining how they work so that people understand the mechanics of it, and don't become afraid of it just because they feel that it's unknowable. And also to hold these companies accountable. Ultimately, they are consolidating an extraordinary amount of power, and will continue to if the public does not demand something different. And so I really hope that was the big mission of my book. Was I really hope that this book can become a platform for people to educate themselves, to develop a critical opinion, and to start asserting their agency for the rights to self-determine their collective future.
Yeah, and I think that's great, and the book does that, right? I think it shines a light on the role that individuals can play, and the way that they should think about their participation in the system. All right, I have a question for you. So just switching gears again, if your book became required reading inside of OpenAI or Google DeepMind or Meta, what parts do you think the employees there would agree with, and what parts would they most have an issue with?
I think most of them would probably agree with the actual reporting, the inside stories of what happened within the company. I did spend a lot of time. I interview close to 100 OpenAI people for the book. And I spent a lot of time really teasing out how people experienced each phase of the company and the decisions that they were making and things like that. And while I was writing the book, I wrote a few articles as well based on my reporting, and that was actually a big magnet for more sources to come and speak with me because they really resonated with how accurately I captured sort of a certain moment in time within the company. But I think for some people, they will really disagree with the framing that OpenAI is ultimately empire. And some of them might also disagree with how critical I am of AGI, or sort of my disbelief of AGI, because there are many people within OpenAI that have a deep-seated belief that AGI is a thing and that it's going to be here soon, and so they might disagree with that as well. But I've been pleasantly surprised. Like I just had an OpenAI source message me saying that he had read a good chunk of the book and he thought it was brilliant. Um, so I do think that the arguments are actually resonating with some people there.
That's great. That's great. It's all a matter of being discerning, right, about the work that you're doing and really understanding the why. Okay, so we're going to turn to a little segment that I call Ask ChatGPT. So I did ask ChatGPT a couple of questions, and I'll read the response. Just want to hear your reflections on what ChatGPT has to say. So my question, are you, ChatGPT, threatened by Karen Hao? ChatGPT, no, I don't experience fear. Okay, good enough. Even if I did, Karen Hao's work strengthens AI by exposing blind spots and pushing for greater alignment with human values. From my perspective, I thought maybe that was covertly flirting with AGI a little bit, but that's just me. I think that's a pretty decent response there. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising to me that ChatGPT said something like that. I mean, ultimately, a lot of if my dad at one point kept asking ChatGPT, who are the top AI reporters? And ChatGPT pretty consistently spits me out in the top 10. And I guess it's just a reflection of the training data for what what opinions are on the internet.
No, well, there it is. All right, last question. How do you think Karen's book will shape the trajectory of AI? ChatGPT says it's likely to impact AI development in subtle but important ways, not by changing algorithms, but by influencing policy debates, pressuring tech companies to be more transparent and accountable, and helping society ask not just what AI can do, but who it serves and at what cost. I think that's pretty darn good. Karen, I don't think you can disagree with that. But what are you hoping the book can achieve? I think you touched on that a little bit earlier, but is there anything else that you'd like to add before we turn it over to our audience today?
No, I think just, yeah, I really wanted to add more context to what many people experienced in their lives as their first introduction to AI, the ChatGPT moment, um, and mm, and really highlight that these technologies are made by people, and none of it is inevitable. And right now, the people in power are a very small group of people, but ultimately, anyone who is a person in this world can actually play a role.
Great. Thank you for those closing remarks. So now we're going to bring back Karen M. So we have Karen H. and Karen M. We'll bring you both on. Okay, first question. What role do you think AI skepticism should play in the framing of both public and private AI governance?
That's a great one. Dr. Myers, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll go ahead. I think having healthy skepticism is going to be very important. You know, a lot of people now look at AI and they think it's magic. They've had that ChatGPT experience as Karen was saying, and they don't necessarily understand the boundaries of what the technology can and cannot do. So I live in Silicon Valley. I go out for dinner and I hear people just talking wildly about, oh, we're just going to plug in the AI technology and it's going to magically solve all these problems that we have.
They don't know who they're sitting next to.
So yes, skepticism is very important. I think people need to, I mean, skepticism is maybe the wrong word. They need to have realistic models of what the technology can do.
Mhm.
And I think, that introduces a number of really important questions, like, educating people about AI technology, what it can do, how they should use it, the limits of the technology, so that they can make sure that whether they're using it for personal reasons or in business settings, that the technology is well matched to the problems that they're trying to solve.
I think that's exactly right. I think just we see time and again that people have a really big automation bias where when they encounter technologies, I was just talking with um, a driver that was driving me yesterday and asking him his relationship with ChatGPT, and he was like, "Oh, I don't really use it, but my kids, like they treat it like an oracle." That they think that it's perfectly neutral and it's sort of like the voice of God telling them how to do things in life and this and that. Um, and I think just that recognition, there's a lot of work to be done to sort of educate people that these are not arbiters of truth. They're not oracles. There is just a lot of automated human decision making that is happening in there, and once there's an acknowledgement and recognition of that, I think it'll really change the way that people think about governing these technologies.
Yeah, those are incredible points, I think, raised by both of you in terms of understanding that there are humans behind the development of AI, and that influences both the way that we think about the truth that's getting spit out of sort of ChatGPT or these other systems, for example, as well as the agency that people have individually to participate or not in the system. And I think that's still a black box for people, right? Really being able to understand where do they have a voice?
Hmm.
Do either of you have thoughts on that in particular? I think that's going to be sort of a big question going forward, which is a lot of people are afraid that they can't really do anything about AI. It's just proceeding, right? And they either get on the train or they don't. But is the what agency do they have to actually influence the direction of AI?
Well, one of the things that I've been telling people is thinking about the full supply chain of AI development. I think I already mentioned sort of, I think about all of the ingredients that need to go into AI models and all the places where AI is deployed. These are all sites of democratic contestation. So, like, if you're a parent and your kids are going to a school that is thinking about whether to adopt AI or potentially has already adopted AI without necessarily having a conversation about it, like you can influence the trajectory of AI development as a consumer by asking your school, like, can we actually have parent-teacher conferences to establish some kind of condition under when these tools are used and not used? And if there are enough people that are doing that and setting certain guardrails of actually we don't want to use this technology, or actually we want to use it, but only if the school can enter a licensing agreement with the company where the data cannot, our kids' data cannot be used for training, then like companies will have to adapt to that. They will have to start creating different
Yeah, I think that's
alternatives.
great. Yeah.
And like if you are a patient going to your doctor's office, like you can have that same conversation if you're going to your workplace and your company is almost definitely now having conversations around how are we going to use it? What is our AI policy? Like having discussions with your coworkers about what how you want to approach it. Where do you set the boundaries? Um, and so I do think that there is actually more agency than people believe that they have. And an analogy that I draw as well is to the fashion industry, which for a really long time also had, egregious environmental, social, and labor harms. But there were enough consumers that realized, wait a minute, we don't want to be buying clothes at the cost of this. And that created an entirely new market for a more ethically sourced, sustainable fashion. And so it was just through pure collective consumer behavior that the fashion industry started changing how they make clothes.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think one, the AI supply chain is very opaque. I mean,
Yeah.
people don't know or understand, right? And I think hopefully that'll be one of the, your book will help do that. And that's
Hmm.
critical. Um, and then two, it's, those for clothes, for example, those are purchases with your credit card, right? So
Yeah.
it's easy to sort of talk with your dollars. The one thing I'm trying to do with my kids is show them that your data is currency, right?
Mhm.
And how do you translate that into what you allow and don't allow, who you allow to have your information? So I think getting across that narrative as well, which is, your data is your currency when it comes
Yes.
to AI and, and the world out there. So, so that'll be important too. Karen, anything to add there?
No, I think Karen Hao did a great job on that one.
Great. I did want to pull through a point of conversation that Karen H. and I had previously, but Karen M., you had touched on it as well in your opening remarks, which is human AI collaboration, and thinking about the principles that matter most when designing AI to support and not replace human workers. We had another question come in around, do you think AI can replace educators and teachers in the classroom? Right, as one example. But what do we need to do to ensure that AI is designed to support and not replace human workers?
Yeah, I love the phrase that Karen Hao used, where she said the technology needs to be in service of the people rather than the other way around. And this has been an ongoing issue in the tech community for decades, right? People are very excited about their technology. I, as a researcher, am guilty of this as well. You're just really excited about what you're able to do, without necessarily understanding the bigger picture of is there pull coming for this technology from the user community? Do people really want this technology? And I worry a little bit that like the AGI concept is that I'm not sure that there are a lot of people that are looking for AGI. That they're looking to solutions to problems that they have right now, which are probably going to be solved more by some of these more narrow types of AI technology.
Yeah. Karen M., I know we talked a little bit with Karen H. about accountability and governance in AI, and a lot of that has to do with workers, for example, rising up and becoming very engaged in the conversation, demanding a seat at the table. Where do you see accountability in AI? Do you see that that's starting to happen more and more, or is that still an area that needs to catch up drastically with the direction of the field?
Yeah, the field is just moving so quickly right now. I think it's very difficult to think about governance and what sort of accountability should be put in place. Karen's work has highlighted some areas of obvious concern where more needs to be done, to protect, for example, the workers in Kenya or other countries that are doing this type of work that's not good for them long term and potentially not being reimbursed appropriately for their efforts. So yeah, it's hard to say right now. There have been a lot of attempts by governments to try to introduce legislation around constraining AI, and it's very difficult. I mean, the legislators don't necessarily have the insights into how the technologies work in order to craft appropriate bills that would serve the societal interests particularly well. So as an example of that, I can go back to when Europe was first thinking about introducing legislation to protect consumers from AI. One of the things they said is all AI technologies that are deployed have to be explainable. Nobody knows how to build explainable AI systems. So, that would have really shut down the use of AI, even in situations where the risk from using the technology was very low. So, they've since refined their perspective on this and now have these different categories of risks and have associated different levels of requirements based on the potential risk from the deployment of the technology, which, makes a lot more sense. So I think it is hard right now, given people's lack of understanding of how the technology works. Even the researchers, right? And the people building these systems don't really understand why the systems are doing the things that they're doing right now. So governance of them is still very much an open problem.
One thing I
Karen,
would love to, yeah, one thing I would love to add to that, there's part of my book focuses on how a challenge that Dr. Myers just said is that there's not enough knowledge and know-how among lay people and policymakers in general to regulate this technology, but also there's not enough independent expertise that they can then call upon to help advise them through the process. And this is one of the things that I draw a parallel to Empire again, is empires sort of have monopolies on knowledge production. So it's really, really hard these days for a policymaker to phone up someone who's not financially conflicted in some way because they are part of this Silicon Valley AGI quest. And so one of the ways to increase accountability, I think, is also to have more investment from different pools of money. I normally say the government, but the government is clearly not in a place right now where it wants to do that. But also from nonprofits, from foundations that can go into cultivating more independent experts that can weigh in on these issues without kind of the financial incentives of being
Yeah.
part of these corporations selling a particular version of AI.
Yeah, obviously, which seems obvious, right?
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna have time for one last question. Here we go, from the audience. What is the most important thing that AI researchers should consider when developing new solutions? I think that could be broadly interpreted, so I will leave it to each of you to think that through and close it out.
There are so many. It's kind of hard to pick one, right? So I mean, resource consumption is one that we touched on earlier. Explainability is another one, really trying to think, if we're thinking about next generation technologies, trying to build technologies that are more accessible, so people can really understand how they work and therefore use them more effectively for the applications of interest.
Yeah, I was sort of going to say something similar, which is I think oftentimes when I'm talking with the research community about ethics, they're not really considering supply chain ethics. They're considering like like model bias or things like that, which is also an important thing. But there are also many upstream problems that we need to think about for the next generation of AI technologies, like resource consumption, as Dr. Myers just mentioned. So I would hope that when thinking about a path forward, that all of the holistic picture is taken into consideration.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here. We are thrilled that you were able to talk to us today about your new book that came out just this week, The Empire of AI. Karen, thanks again so much for being here, and best of luck to you as you continue your tour. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.